Hello and welcome to Fail Forward, a series of videos all about the bits of games which don't quite work and why. This episode is all about Life is Strange, an episodic adventure series by Don't Nod Entertainment set in a US high school. And it's one queer fish. I think I might actually love the game, not because all of it works, but because it's so interesting when and why it doesn't. In this video I'll be looking at several of these malfunctions and pulling them apart, strand by strand, hopefully without spoiling the game's plot in the process, as, regardless of these flaws, I'd recommend anyone to play it. Though I'd forgive you for not having been interested in the series hitherto. On the surface it looks like it might be agonisingly twee. Twin Peaks by way of Sabrina the Teenage Witch, and delivered via the choice and consequence formula already stretched thin by Telltale Games' ever-swelling roster of narrative-led transmedia franchises. But beneath the cliches of US high school drama is an unusually low-key and earnest Bildungsroman. You play as Max, an introverted 18-year-old girl who returns to her coastal hometown after years of living in the big city. Here she reconnects with a childhood friend whose life has unravelled in her absence, and it's this relationship that is really at the heart of the game, a sensitive and thoughtful take on a particularly complex friendship, as both participants in it struggle with their own processes of self-discovery. For Max, part of this self-discovery is that she suddenly develops the ability to manipulate time, and the game begins with her foreseeing a terrible calamity befall the town, which she must then work to prevent. Peculiarly though, this doesn't do much to shift the languorous register of the game, or drag you away from its preoccupation with personal relationships and the social hazards of the US school system. And that's great, as when dramatic events do unfold, the day-to-day human context in which they are placed renders them with the appropriately devastating scale.
What's up, Justin?
Getting my coffee on before I cut class and destroy some rails.
One thing the game is caught flack for is its clumsy appropriation of youth speak. I admit that I'm now so old and decrepit that I can barely understand what some of the characters are saying, and it does occasionally ring with the clanging falsity of an adult attempting to sound desperately hip in a howdy-do fellow kids sort of way. But though I recognise that as an imperfection with the game's own agenda, the reason that this is an interesting failure is that the falsity feels oddly right to me. It's not that the particular words or phrases sound anything like the kind of patois me and my friends had when we were teenagers, but that now with the value of hindsight I can see so much of my behaviour and speech as a teenager as a kind of play acting. When I was that age I was in search of my place in the world and indeed my own identity, and there's a reason that changes in fashion and language are largely instigated by the young. Trends blossom from the act of borrowing ideas that you come into contact with, a sort of magpie or chameleonic behaviour that is part of trying to establish your position in the world, and the objectivity one gains over that process with subsequent decades of miserable living makes it easy to cringe when you remember such acts of gauche appropriation, clanging with a similar sort of naivety and clumsiness that the script of this game achieves, albeit unintentionally. And so, by failing to sound like kids speaking today, it somehow manages to access a deeper truth about language and adolescence. Weird.
Railroad tracks always make me feel better. I have no idea why.
Kerouac knew. It's the romance of travel and movement. The sound of the train whistle at night.
Look at the beat poet here.
Life is Strange is undoubtedly a beautiful game, with an attention to composition and light like few others. Altogether appropriate given that Max is a budding photographer, and the game sometimes takes a moment from the action just to show you this stuff. Montages of images that show off Don't Nod's acumen both for constructing incredible well-storied spaces and then for capturing them in ways which provoke emotion through their framing. It's hard not to be wooed by the way light scatters softly through a fluttering American flag draped over a window, filling a messy bedroom with a warm bloom. And yet, Don't Nod have made a particularly bold and odd aesthetic choice to render many of the game's textures as speed paint scribbles. From afar, the polygonal fidelity in the Unreal Engine's amazing lighting model seem to strive for and often achieve realism or hyperrealism. But then up close, textures are composed of thickly brushed daubs. Computer screens, posters, prize-winning photographs are all cursory hand drawings without any pretense of being otherwise. I'm hesitant to call this a failure because I don't think it really hurts the game and probably made the production of these assets a lot more feasible. But it is noticeable and occasionally jarring when a wisp of wind is drawn as a cartoonish swirl that whisks in front of a wooden slatted house that is otherwise lit with a powerful sense of fidelity. Or when you look at a flock of starlings and realise they are in fact a terrible particle effect, and their individual stylings decay and vanish like the floating embers of a fire. Or when Max coos over a photograph she particularly admires and it turns out to look like a thumb with a face drawn on it. Life is Strange is a game about capturing a chosen reality, partly through lenses, and partly through a discussion of the nature of time, the ability to undo things for the better. And the scribbled textures don't really seem to have a place within that thematically. Of course, other media like films have long had polystyrene backdrops that wobble as actors rush past, but Life is Strange lays itself open to even greater scrutiny. It wants you to see it as a construction, as artifice, to show you the secretive workings behind its trick. And in another game, that might make a powerful consonance with a narrative about such themes, but here works against the fiction. Life is indeed strange, but there comes a point with abstraction, perhaps the point where you abstract birds to particle effects, when you are no longer depicting life at all. Let's talk about the game's principal success in order to set up the next interesting failure. The central gimmick of Life is Strange is that the player can rewind time at nearly any moment and redo challenges or choose different dialogue options. Though this conceit misfires in ways we will soon examine, it is largely a triumph which completely changes the way that both designers and players view the role of choice and consequence in the game. The formula it is improving upon is, of course, that established by Telltale Games' various adventures, The Walking Dead, The Wolf Among Us, or the recent Game of Thrones interactive fiction. I have to say, I'm less and less a fan of how these games function. When I first played them, I enjoyed the fiction enough that it buoyed me through a lot of the stuff I felt was unsatisfactory in an interactive way. But as time has gone on, the crude systems that chaperone you through its narrative have only become more apparent to me, and now I feel that most of the time I'd prefer to imbibe the story in its original non-interactive form and stumble through the stiff puppetry of Telltale's cutscenes and bounce through its pachinko set of contrived decisions. And don't get me started on the QTEs. My major complaint with these games is the way that choices are delivered to you as perfectly symmetrical content options. Choose thing A and have an A flavoured experience, or choose thing B and have a B flavoured experience, each equal in length and value. This is strikingly not how reality operates, or even the fictions on which Telltale Games are based. Look at Game of Thrones. One of the central themes of George R.R. Martin's fiction is that life does not follow any patently predictable plan. It's just rolling chaos from one end of the earth to the other, and a hero's fate rests on a pinhead. Decisions in that world are horribly asymmetric. Choose thing A and have an A flavoured experience, or choose thing B and watch as your loved one's bowels are burnt in a skillet in front of you. Nothing is fair or equal about the causality at work in Westeros, and yet Telltale's games offer choices that are so balanced as to feel sterile, and even the most dramatic choices end up feeling sapped of meaning. Life is Strange, however, lets you undo choices. In fact, it encourages you to do so at every point, to play things out one way, recant and play them through again. This has two powerful effects. Firstly, it relieves the designers of the need to make the repercussions of these choices feel particularly equal. Indeed, Life is Strange is a game with a strong moral centre. And while there are plenty of tough choices in there, many of them have a moral dimension that, if you contemplate it, ultimately points you in one direction. You can see this from the stats at the end of each episode. Most players choose the same outcomes. And the second part of it is that the ability to change your mind means that you really do contemplate these decisions. You get to see what it would be like to be a jerk to someone who's crossed you, and then, given the option to undo this, you also get to choose the better part of your nature. The ability to see outcomes before resting upon one actually strips away enough of the tensions of playing a game, the desire to experience content, the fear of enduring a decision you didn't have all the facts to understand, and makes you more alive to the moral conundrum at its core. This isn't always true, however. Sometimes you're asked to choose between saying two extremely dumb things that, having seen the consequences of both, you would simply not say. And worse, the second episode repeatedly offers you a way to use your time powers that undermines the logic of its fiction. The second episode of Life is Strange is something of a disaster in my opinion, and not altogether for interesting reasons. A lot of its puzzles are just incoherently designed. There's a weird bit where you need to not shoot bottles even though you've been told to shoot bottles, and the game repeatedly instantly fails you without explanation for failing to do the thing that it didn't ask you to do. There's also a thing whereby critical events later in the episode rely on you having ransacked a friend's bedroom for intimate details of her life, while she is sitting in the room crying her eyes out. This isn't who I am, and it's not who I thought my character was either. And in any case, the presentation of this evidence at a later moment seems like a completely bizarre way to forestall the terrible thing you're trying to forestall. These dialogue options are presented as a multiple choice mnemonic quiz, in which you have to recall the evidence you acquired earlier. It's a setup they use several times throughout the episode, and it's always terrible, in a really interesting way. This is easy to see in a Groundhog Day inspired sequence in which you try to prove your powers to a friend while sitting in a cafe. You watch events unfold, commit a bunch of stuff to memory, and then return to the past, where you're given a multiple choice questionnaire on your precognition. As it happens, even the correct options are so badly worded as to barely describe the actual events. But what's so truly weird about this puzzle is that the incorrect choices don't reflect anything either you or Max would possibly think to say. To preserve the actual puzzle for would-be players of the game, let's use some false examples. Say that, during the sequence you're committing to memory, a beautiful butterfly lands on the windowsill, but you and Max just don't spot it, you're looking somewhere else. When it comes to choosing what you saw, the game would give you the butterfly as one of the choices, and 3 other options of things that didn't happen. I don't know, an eagle swooping into a window pane, or RPS managing editor Graham Smith windmilling freely down the street outside, or the sudden manifestation of the blood god Baal whom we all serve, praise be to Baal, may his reign be eternal. Where do these options come from? Not from the player, not from the reality of the game world where these things haven't even occurred, and not from Max. An absence of memory does not offer up bizarre fictions about subjects you have not knowingly encountered. It's a really strange moment and a weird problem to have that ends up distancing you from the character and from the fiction and from the game. Perhaps realising this, the 3rd episode does away with this form of puzzle altogether. Puzzles are internally consistent with the knowledge Max and the player has. You do a lot more snooping, but you are given more compelling context for these actions, and there is no dissonance between the game's requirements and social propriety. There are still some dialogue choices that seem like things I wouldn't ever want to say, but on the whole it's much more successful, and its final section embraces the ethical problems of manipulating time in a ferociously bold way. I'm really not sure where they will go with it next, so dramatic are these events, and that's such an exciting place to be. Life is Strange is a game unafraid to experiment with the medium, and even if sometimes those experiments end up producing acid burns and lab fires, they're well worth it for the greater discoveries that lie at the end of the path.